So we've seen kind of the key events that have happened in the history of Earth. And these go along with kind of a rise and fall of major groups of organisms over time. And there are many things that affect the distribution of organisms and like what was common in certain times and when things disappear, and a huge impact on what organisms are prevalent is the environment. So continental drift is based on the theory of plate tectonics, that the continents exist on these massive plates on the surface crust of the Earth, and they kind of float on the hot mantle of the Earth, and over time they move very slowly. So that's the idea of continental drift, that the plates of the Earth are moving something like centimeters per year. And what we can do when we look back at the history of Earth is we can see that about 250 million years ago, when we had animals on land, that the Earth probably looked more like this picture down here, with a supercontinent called Pangaea. And when the Earth formed Pangaea, at the time, most of the marine life was living in shallow water. And so this would have probably killed a lot of marine life, because what happened here is a lot of the shallow water habitat was destroyed, and the oceans got deeper. And then the internal area of this land would have been very cold and dry. So after Pangaea formed, over time, the continents have started to drift apart until we reach what looks like the planet as we know it today. And this helps us to explain some of the distribution of organisms and fossils. So the drifting apart of the continents has led to allopatric speciation, meaning allo meaning other. So species that used to be able to kind of walk the entirety of Pangaea are now separated by oceans. And when you spend enough time separated again, those reproductive isolative measures start to form. And now species that may have been related are distantly separate species. The Pangaea supercontinent also explains why we find fossils of seeming very similar fossils of even the same species found in extremely different areas, like from Brazil to West Africa, where we think that Brazil and West Africa would have at one point been very close to each other, but now are separated by the entire Atlantic Ocean. But we find fossils of the same organisms in both of those places. So another massive change and kind of a pattern that can be seen over the history of Earth is something called extinction. Extinction is when an entire species is gone. All of the living organisms of that species die off and it doesn't exist anymore. And extinctions happen all of the time, either because of the environment that changes or because other species move into that environment, and interactions like competition, predation. So there's always extinctions happening. But we've seen throughout the history of Earth 5 mass extinctions. And a mass extinction is a time when the extinction rate was extremely high. And you can see it on the graph. The red line shows the extinction rate. So you can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 mass extinctions. And then the blue line is the number of families. And so every time the extinction rate is really high, the number of families drops off precipitously. And there's 2 mass extinctions that we give a lot of attention to. The first is the Permian, that's right here, this biggest one. And we think that this was due to massive amounts of volcanic activity at the time. So this would be at the end of the Permian, right before the Triassic. And there were massive volcanic explosions all over the Earth. And so we think that the clouds of volcanic ash dramatically changed the environment. The environment got warmer. There was lots of CO2 in the atmosphere. This would have caused ocean acidification. A lot of the stuff we're actually seeing now from global warming, but on an much more extreme scale. And then the second one that we pay a lot of attention to is the Cretaceous mass extinction. So that's right here. and that would have been the end of the age of the dinosaurs. So this is, we believe, precipitated by some kind of large asteroid or comet that collided with the Earth. And the reason that we think this is because there is a layer of iridium clay that's found to date around this time, and iridium is not very common on Earth. So we think that an asteroid landed on the planet, shot up this big cloud dust that allowed iridium to settle, and the consequences of the asteroid changed the environment such that those large reptiles, like the dinosaurs, were unable to survive. The only group of dinosaurs that still exist are the birds, which are ancestors related to dinosaurs. There's speculation that we're going through another mass extinction now, and if not yet, we will be soon. So there's something called a background rate of extinction, and this is just the number of species that would go extinct in any normal kind of time when the environments are very stable. But what we think is happening right now is that the number of extinctions is actually 100 to 1,000 times more than it would be normally. And it's, of course, hard for us to track this because we don't know all of the species that are undiscovered that could go extinct before we ever even discover them. But we believe this is called the human mass extinction because it's happening because of human actions. So humans are destroying habitats, introducing species, over-harvesting, and other factors. And habitat loss used to be the number one human-driven factor that affected environments of organisms to cause extinction, but we're finding lately that the number one is actually climate change. So humans are continuing to damage the planet and causing the global temperatures to rise. And so when we change the environment of the entire planet, we're going to have to see organisms that either adapt. Some organisms will adapt by through natural selection by developing new adaptations. Organisms also often move, so they'll move to like higher altitudes or higher latitudes in order to kind of go where it's cooler. But eventually, if the planet gets too warm, that becomes not an option. And then the other option organisms have is to die. So if they can't either deal or move with the changing climate, then they won't be able to survive. And unless we take drastic action, and we've seen that an increase in the world temperature by even, I think, 2 to 3 degrees Celsius is going to cause extreme mass change. And we're already starting to see this. We've seen the polar winds from the north. We've seen huge amounts of fires in California and Australia. Hurricane seasons seem to be getting worse and worse and worse because the oceans are warmer and warmer, powering more strong hurricanes. That we're seeing like climactic global scale consequences of having a warmer climate. All right, so what happens after an extinction? After an extinction, we have huge amounts of space or ecological niches that are unoccupied because those organisms died out. So usually it takes 5 to 10 million years or even up to 100 million years for the diversity to come back after a extinction. But a lot of the time it comes back with a radiation. So after every mass extinction, we saw what was called an adaptive radiation. And this is rapid evolution, so much faster than kind of what would be the normal rate of evolution. So an adaptive radiation is a period of rapid evolutionary change, and it can follow mass extinctions because large amounts of organisms have died out. So now the organisms that are left can allow for natural selection to kind of let them overtake those areas. It can follow the evolution of novel characteristics. This was common in the Cambrian explosion. So it became evident that organisms were now able to kind of feed on each other because there were more organisms around, and predators developed methods of hunting and capturing prey. And those novel characteristics became so successful that there was a massive radiation of predators and then also prey organisms with these new characteristics during the Cambrian explosion. And then colonization of new regions. So with massive continental drift or huge environmental changes, organisms might find themselves able to all of a sudden reach new areas.